Well, greetings, Management 308 students. We're going to cover Chapter 23 today in our discussion. This is a chapter on risk management for small businesses. And this is also a chapter that's going to be full of all kinds of definitions. And I'll try to point out to you the key elements of the chapter as far as what you really need to retain and understand as we go through. So let's get started on it. It's going to be a lot of definitions. We'll go through those fairly quickly, and then what we really want to do is address how do you confront risk in small businesses and startup businesses. Well, here is a kind of some basic definitions. Risk is the possibility of suffering harm or loss, and then you can go through each one of these and take a look at them and ponder them a little bit. But I want you to look at pure risk, because this is what we'll be talking about when we talk about risk. Pure risk is the uncertainty associated with a situation where only loss or no loss can occur. There's no potential gain, only downside. And this is also the only form of risk that is insurable. Now let's look at some other definitions here. Real property is land and anything physically attached to the land, such as buildings. Personal property then becomes the stuff that you put in those buildings, machinery, equipment, furniture, fixtures, and so forth. And the replacement value of the property is the cost to replace or replicate the property at today's prices. It's not necessarily what you paid for the property, but it's what it would cost to replace it. And oftentimes when you have an insurance company involved, you get into arguments about, well, what was the real value of the property we're trying to replace? And insurance companies are very, very good at undervaluing property that's to be replaced. Actual cash value is the insurance term that refers to the depreciated value of a property. And this gets into the previous comment I made, that this is where you end up in debates with insurance companies over what the real value, depreciated value of a property is. And here is where you can get into it. Let's say you've got a piece of equipment that has a normal life of, say, 3 years, and you've depreciated it 100%, and in the fourth year you have a fire and it burns up, or some other type of event happens. Then you're in a real argument as to the value of that the value of that piece of property. Some other definitions: peril is the cause of loss, either through natural events or through the acts of people. Direct loss is a loss in which physical damage to property reduces its value to the property owner. So if I have a piece of equipment or a building that's damaged in a storm, then that's a direct loss. But then there's always indirect loss associated with that too, because now I'm perhaps prevented from building or supplying product to my customers, and so now I have an indirect loss. It's the loss from the inability to carry on your normal operations. Now, workers on statutory liability, what that means is this is liability that's governed by law, and workers' compensation legislation is a big area of legal requirements or statutory requirements on liability. And these are laws that obligate the employer to pay the employee for an employment-related injury or illness regardless of fault. And most state laws, particularly here in Texas, require that a company have workers' comp insurance. This is the insurance that provides this type of coverage that we're talking about here. Contractual liability is a risk that can appear in contracts, and in fact it often appears in contracts. For example, in the terms and conditions of a contract, it may spell out exactly what constitutes a default on the contract, and once you're into a default situation, then all kinds of liabilities begin to rear their ugly head. So you have to be very, very aware of risk that are contained just within the simple process of signing or agreeing to a contract. An indemnification clause, easy enough for you to say, indemnification clause is a contractual clause. Listen carefully now, this is very important. A contractual clause that requires one party to assume the financial consequences of another party's legal liabilities. Where you'll see this pop up often is in contracts for sale. Let's say that I've agreed to sell my company to another person. That person then will probably want, if they know what they're doing, they will want to add an indemnification clause into the sale contract that says this, basically: all things that I become liable for that actually occurred while you were owner of the company, you have to cover. That's what an indemnification clause does in a sale contract. And so it's not unusual to have various types of indemnification clauses in contractual agreements. Well, a tort is a wrongful act or omission for which an injured can take legal action against the wrongdoer for monetary damages. We see this word tort mentioned all the time. And there's a big debate going on in the country right now about torts and laws that prevent frivolous lawsuits, and the trial lawyers group that's basically looking around for opportunities to litigate, to be in court so that they can make money. And so that's a whole big debate going on right now. And so what a number of state governments have done, including Texas, and the federal government has yet to tackle this, is to construct laws, upgraded laws, that limit the amount of damages that a party can collect in a tort, in a lawsuit for some wrongful act. And this, of course, has reduced the market for the trial lawyers, and so the trial lawyers are upset about this, and they constantly oppose any limits to damages. But there has to be some middle ground here where we can do away with frivolous lawsuits and do away with trial lawyers who are just running around looking for some deep pockets that they can go collect a big settlement from. I've been involved in public service for a long, long time in terms of serving on boards and various elected and appointed positions. And it's very, very common for a lawyer to come after a government agency because they perceive the government agency as having deep pockets. After all, they're living off taxpayers' money. And oftentimes, particularly in smaller communities, you'll see school boards that will cave at the first hint of a lawsuit by some attorney. And most of the time, those attorneys are filing the lawsuits with the intention of trying to get a settlement rather than taking it to court. My personal philosophy has always been that if some attorney feels like he's got a case for action, then bring the action on and we'll settle it in court. Most of the time, if you have that type of philosophy, then the trial lawyers will pretty well leave you alone because they know they're going to have a hard time squeezing any money out of you. Establishing negligence is another process where you have to try to determine if there has been some negligent activity. It's a legal duty between parties to act or not to act to cause injury or damage. Negligence is also a failure to provide the appropriate standard of care, or it's the presence of actual injury or damages that occur, or it's an action that was proximate cause of injury or damage. In other words, if you've done something or you are operating in a way that is negligent, then you're going to be liable in any injury or damage that results from that negligence. In liability law or contractual liability, there's always the reasonable standard or the prudent person standard. And oftentimes you'll hear it called the prudent person standard. And basically what that says is, this is the standard of care or the standard of operation based on what a reasonable or prudent person would have done under similar circumstances. And so as you and perhaps your opponents are trying to determine that negligence really occurred, then kind of overriding all that is going to be the prudent person standard that says, is this something that was reasonable or unreasonable that occurred in terms of negligence? Compensatory damages are those damages that are intended to make a claimant whole by indemnifying the claimant for any injuries or damage arising from the negligent action. There's that word indemnification or indemnifying again. What this means is that compensatory damages are those damages that cover any actual injuries or damage that arise from a negligent or negligence in an action. And so that's called making the claimant whole or indemnifying the claimant for any damages or cost of injuries that occur. Economic damages are the damages that are related to an economic loss, such as medical expense or loss of income or the cost of property replacement. Non-economic damages are those compensatory damages for such losses as pain and suffering, mental anguish, and loss of consortium. Now, loss of consortium, I'm really not familiar with that term in terms of actually knowing what it means legally, but I can only guess that it means the loss of what we might call networking, or the loss of working together with your customers or with other people in the way that you do business. Again, the non-economic damages can also include punitive damages, which the definition is at the bottom of this chart. These are the damages intended to punish wrongdoers or the persons who have acted negligently for gross negligence or a callous disregard for the interest of others and to have a deterrent effect. And so the non-economic punitive side of damages can get to be very, very large and very, very unreasonable, depending upon what a lawyer and a jury may think. And we've seen some extreme cases in recent years of a jury awarding very unrealistic punitive damages. In many cases, when you see these extreme punitive damages awarded in a jury trial, then on appeal, those damages are greatly reduced by the appeals court. So here are some sources of tort liability. You can see premises liability. This is the fact that you have some liability just because you have a building and land. Operations liability. This is the liability that occurs because you've got operations going on within your buildings or on your land. Professional liability. This is the liability that occurs because you fail to act professionally or in your profession according to the rules of your profession. Employer's liability is your liability that you have as an employer. Automobile liability is fairly obvious. I think we all have that if we drive automobiles. Product liability, if you produce products, you'll have that. Completed operations liability, this is the liability that something that you did and you called complete really wasn't complete or it didn't operate according to the contract. And then directors and officers liability, this is also sometimes called D&O liability. And I'll just go ahead and make a comment now. If you ever serve as a director or as an officer of a company, you want to make sure that you have coverage on this liability right here, because if you'll notice that any time a company is sued, the directors and officers are included in that lawsuit by name. And if you are a director of a corporation, a C corporation or an S corporation or an LLC, any type of company has a liability protection, you'll be included in any lawsuits by name. And so one of the things you want to have is insurance is going to protect you in that case, because let's go back to the real world. In the real world, if you're involved with a board of directors or an officer in a company that's got quote unquote deep pockets, then the trial lawyers are going to come after you. And in every case, they'll name you as an officer or as a board member in the lawsuit. In some cases, that may stick. In many cases, one of the first things you'll do is have your lawyer ask the judge to remove your name from the lawsuit. In many cases, the judges will do that. But you just want to protect yourself in this area. Product liability, let's talk a little bit about that. We mentioned it a moment ago. You could have a product liability. You have a manufacturing defect, or if you have a design defect, this is a fundamental flaw that has occurred because of the particular type of design you have. Or you could have a marketing defect. This is a defect resulting from failure to convey to the user that hazards are associated with a product or to provide adequate instructions on safe product use. This is why you see so many caution paragraphs on any product nowadays. Any product package or any product label will have all types of disclaimers as to negligence. You can thank your local trial attorney for that. Personnel risks that directly affect individual employees but may have an indirect impact on the business as well. This could be premature death or poor health or insufficient retirement income. And this is not insufficient retirement income for the employee but it could be the fact that the company has not set aside the money that they had planned to provide for their retired employees, so that they can't really meet those commitments. And sometimes that happens. In today's world, we've done a pretty good job of staying on top of that, and many companies now that have, particularly larger companies that have retirement programs, they do a good job of not only defining what retirement income an employee will have, but preserving the funds that are set aside for that retirement income. Risk management involves ways of coping with risks that are designed to preserve assets and the earning power of a firm. That's an important point to remember. Also remember that this involves finding the best way possible to reduce the cost of dealing with risk. This is a very important point right here, that when we do risk management, we're trying to make sure that we've identified our risk, that we have properly assessed the risk, that we have properly valued the risk, and now we're going to come up with a plan or a management scheme for how we minimize that cost of managing that risk. Another point I'll make is that insurance is only one of several approaches to minimizing the pure risk a firm is sure to encounter. So insurance, the basic point here is that insurance is not always the answer to handling risk. So here's the process that we use when we evaluate risk, and these are some of the terms that I've spelled out for you just a moment ago. We've got to first identify and understand the risk. Then we've got to evaluate them from the standpoint of what is their probability of occurring, and if they do occur, what's going to be the cost of that risk. Then we've got to select what are our possible methods, what are the options that we have to manage the risk, and then we have to make our decision and then periodically review and evaluate. So if you're running a company or you own a company, from time to time you want to sit down and you want to value your risk. You want to go through this risk management process and make sure that you're not overly exposed in some area to some costs that could possibly bankrupt or cause your company to cease to operate. So here are some typical risks that companies might encounter. These are risks on the road to success. So you have risks from floods and fire and theft and shoplifting, customer injury, employment liability, contractual litigation. This is always a risk if you're doing contracts. Insufficient retirement funds, bankruptcy. What happens if you had to file bankruptcy? Threats to your technology, product service liability, new competitors, bad debts, loss of key employees. All of these are typical everyday risks that a normal company will encounter. And so we have to decide what are we going to do to stay on top of those. So let's look at, for small companies, typically what happens is that the small company is so busy trying to stay alive that it doesn't really pay the attention to risk that it should, and oftentimes is caught off guard by the risk, which when they occur, can sink the company. Large firms do a much better job because they've got the resources to do it and the personnel and the talent to manage their risk properly. But nevertheless, I'm going to recommend, and our text recommends, that risk management is not confined to large firms, that small firms need to be doing risk management as well. Take a realistic look at what your real risks are. So risk control involves three major things: loss prevention, loss avoidance, and loss reduction. Loss prevention simply says we're going to try to set everything up so that we don't have losses. We're going to try to operate in such a way that we don't have losses. Loss avoidance means that we're going to try to avoid the cost that could occur from possible losses. We just want to do away with the losses altogether. So that means that should we have a loss, then we may want to have some way of covering that loss, either through insurance or some other fund that we might have set aside for it. And then loss reduction simply means that we're going to try to eliminate or reduce the probability of losses actually occurring. So we'll set up plans to do that as well. Companies spend a lot of time dealing in these three areas right here of risk control and risk management. So let's look at risk financing just for a little bit. There's several terms here that probably we need to talk about just a little bit. Self-insurance simply means that I'm going to make my company look like an insurance company. I'll set aside the money to provide for the insurance coverage in specific areas. Most often you'll see this with large companies on their health care programs or their health insurance programs. Most large companies' health insurance programs are self-insured programs. The way that works is each year the actuaries will do their calculations and determine what the probability or the high bar probability or the most likely probability of a company having certain levels of cost for health care, and then that company will set aside those funds according to the recommendations of the analyst. Risk retention means I'm going to retain that risk. I know that it's a risk. I've identified it. I put a value on it. I'm going to live with it, which means one of two things, or both really. It means, first of all, the probability of risk is low, and secondly, it could mean that the value or the cost of the risk is low. So that's kind of an ideal case for risk retention. You could also have retain the risk if the cost is low, but the probability is higher. You know, you're just willing to pay for it. Risk transfer means that I've recognized I have a risk, I put a value to it, I'm going to transfer it to somebody else, and this somebody else could be an insurance company. A partially self-funded program is like self-insurance, but I'm paying a portion of it. And then on stop-loss limit, I just simply say, hey, once I get to this loss right here, I'm just going to stop at that point right there. I'll either stop doing that activity, or else I'll figure out a way to cover the loss. And then an aggregate stop-loss limit is where I aggregate or I accumulate a certain level of loss before I put a stop on it. Now let's look at kind of a matrix or a little decision table for how we handle risk. On the left-hand side is the amount of loss. Low severity means that it's a low loss or comparably low loss, or a high severity means that it could be a high loss if the risk occurs. And then low frequency simply means it's low probability, and high frequency means a high probability that the loss will occur. So you can see in the case of low frequency, high cost, I'll either take a loss prevention approach or a loss reduction approach. I'm going to try to prevent that loss from occurring. I'm going to take all kinds of actions to try to keep it from occurring. In the case of a high cost, high probability, then I'm going to take a loss prevention or a loss reduction approach again right there. I'm going to try to keep that loss from occurring. I'm going to put programs in place to try to make it not happen. I'm going to increase the probability. I'm sorry, I'm going to decrease the probability, increase the likelihood that it will not occur. On a low-cost situation, if it's high frequency, I may just retain that risk. I just may, if it's a high probability of occurring, I may just live with it and cover it if it should occur. If it's low frequency, it means it's got a low probability of occurring. I may retain it, or I may just try to develop programs to keep it from happening altogether, or to reduce the cost of the loss. So there's several things that I can do. Once I get into this area right here, I've got a lot more options than I do in this area right here, the high cost versus low cost. Low cost risk, I have a lot of options on how to handle those. On high cost risk, my options get narrowed down quite a bit. Sometimes, typically here, you're going to probably transfer it, which means you'll bring in the insurance companies. So in evaluating an insurance program, you've got to first identify where are your risks, and where are the risks that first of all can be insured, and then try to determine what your possible losses might be, and then you want to secure coverage for all those. And then lastly, you want to try to relate your premium cost to the probability of loss. In other words, you want to always take an analytical look that says, if I get insurance to cover this risk right here, but the cost of this risk is, say, $100, and my premium are going to cost me $150 or $200, then I may want to stand back and reevaluate whether I want to even get any insurance for that at all, because I'm looking at my out-of-pocket costs, my out-of-pocket expenses, and so I might be able to cover that risk without having to spend money on insurance. So here's some requirements for obtaining insurance. And these are pretty common and pretty standard requirements. First of all, the risk has to be calculable. In other words, I've got to be able to do some sort of analysis that determines how much that risk could cost to cover the losses on. The risk has got to exist in large enough numbers to allow the law of averages to work. This is where insurance kicks in. When insurance will cover those items where there's a large enough set of candidates or a large enough population of those events occurring, which takes the bias out of it, and makes it a more statistically acceptable size to work with, and so now the analyst can sit down and predict pretty accurately, based upon the statistics of these risks occurring and how much they're going to cost. And so for insurance to work, you've got to have a large number of risk that exists in that category, in that family. The insured property must have commercial value, so you've got to have some value to whatever it is you're trying to insure. And then the policyholder themselves must have an insurable interest in the property or the person injured. In other words, if I'm the owner or if I'm a president of a corporation, then I've got an insurable interest in the property or person insured. So let's look at some different types of business insurance, and some of these you've heard of before, but we'll just kind of talk about them. Most of these are kind of definitions. Property and casualty insurance, named peril approach falls in this. This is where we identify specific perils that we want to try to cover, like flooding. An all-risk approach is kind of a general purpose type of approach that says we're going to cover everything. Co-insurance provision says I'm going to pay to insure part of the losses that could occur, and then I will cover the other part of the losses. So typically the requirement here is that property must be insured for at least 80% of its value, or a penalty will be applied to any covered loss. And we're going to look at an example of this here in just a second. Here's that example. If an insured building had a replacement value of $500,000, the 80% policy limit would require that the property be insured for at least $400,000. That's 80% of 500. If the building was insured for only $300,000 and an insured loss of $100,000 occurred, the recovery would be limited to $75,000. And you calculate that with the equation below there. You take the insured value, divide that by the policy limit percentage times the replacement value, and then multiply that times the property loss. And so in this case here, you can see that in a $300,000 in a $100,000 loss, the owner would only be able to recover under that insurance provision $75,000, 3/4 of the loss. We're still talking about property and casualty insurance, and business interruption insurance is a type of insurance that covers the cost if for some reason your business is interrupted and you can't operate the way that you normally operate. Now, commercial general liability coverage covers bodily injury and property damage for which the business is liable, and this is a kind of a broad-based policy. And then automobile insurance, you're pretty familiar with that, protects against liability and physical damage to a vehicle resulting from insured perils such as collision, theft, vandalism, hail, and flood. Workers' comp insurance provides benefits to employees for medical expenses, loss of wages, and rehab expenses, as well as death benefits for employees' families. Crime insurance is coverage against employee dishonesty. So those are some definitions I think that you probably understand pretty well. So a BOP, that's a business owner's policy, is very much like a homeowner's policy. It's designed to cover a broad set of risk and needs for the small business owners. And typically when you kind of lump all these losses together, you end up with a lower net premium in this type of a general policy than you might otherwise have incurred if you were going to insure each of the losses independently. The other nice thing about this type of broad coverage policy is it includes automatic business interruption insurance and replacement value protection as opposed to actual cash value protection. So that's a big difference right there, replacement value versus actual cash value, because the ACV includes depreciation, so your actual cash value might be zero on your books if you've lost some important assets. A package policy is a policy for small businesses that do not qualify for a BOP that combines property insurance and commercial general liability insurance. And again, this is will have a lower premium than if you had to cover those coverages separately. Health insurance is exactly what it says it is right there. Again, I will tell you that most large companies do self-insurance here. They set aside their own funds to cover this, and the insurance company that's involved with them typically is only the back office processor. They process all the claims and all of the payouts and do all of the back office type things that insurance companies have to do to provide this coverage. But as far as serving as the insurance company here, they do not. The company itself serves as the insurance provider. An HMO, most of you are familiar with that. It's a managed care network that's less expensive than a PPO. Limits employees' choices. A PPO is a preferred provider organization. You see these two terms all the time. If you're like me, I have to sit down every once in a while and say, okay, now tell me what an HMO is versus a PPO. they're both managed care networks. One of them is just more extensive than the other. Key person insurance. This is something that's really important, and then disability insurance is also important. This is the disability insurance is insurance that you might cover against an important partner or some important officer in the company. Key person insurance is insurance that covers the death or the loss from the death of a key person. And every company, no matter big or small, has a small group of really, really key people in that company that if you were to lose any one or more of those people, it would be a significant setback for your company. And so in those cases there, you want to provide key person insurance to cover those possible costs. And this is an area where you have to sit down and do that analysis and figure out, well, what would those losses possibly be? Okay, these are some of the key terms we've covered, all these definitions that we've covered today. And this is going to wrap up our discussion of Chapter 23, Risk Management for Small Businesses. Lots of definitions in this chapter. You want to try to be as familiar as you can with those. There'll be some of them will be covered on the exam coming up, and you just need to be aware of them, be as familiar as you can. Not the most interesting stuff for a lot of people, but very interesting for some, and it's very, very necessary if you're going to operate a business.